The wind cut like blades as Grace Turner dragged her two little kids along the snow-covered road. Their shoes were soaked, and every step felt harder than the last. Willow Creek, Montana had always had tough winters, but this one seemed hell-bent on breaking them. Grace squeezed the icy little hand of Noah, her 7-year-old son, while balancing 4-year-old Lily on her hip. The little girl was shivering even under her thin coat, and Grace fought hard to keep it together. The house they'd been renting had been taken over by the bank after Grace couldn't keep up with the rent. Since then, they'd been walking, searching for any shelter, any shot at survival. She had no one left to turn to. No parents, no friends, just the desperate faith of a mother who would do anything to protect her kids. The sky was a dark, heavy gray, and the twisted trees looked like skeletons against the snow. The few houses they passed were locked up tight, curtains drawn. It felt like the whole world had turned its back on them. "Mommy, I'm hungry," Lily mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. Grace closed her eyes for a second, feeling that crushing pain in her chest. She knew. She was starving too. They hadn't had anything but crumbs of stale bread and sips from a nearly empty water bottle for 2 days. "I know, sweetheart. I know," she said, trying to smile. "Just a little more. We're gonna find a warm place, I promise." But promises were easy. Keeping them, Grace wasn't so sure she could anymore. When the first flakes of a new snowstorm started to fall, she knew time was running out. If they didn't find shelter soon, they wouldn't make it through the night. In a desperate move, she pulled the kids toward an old church she spotted ahead. The rusty bell swung at the top of the tower, creaking against the wind. The door was shut tight, but Grace banged on it hard, the sound echoing into the emptiness. Nothing. She banged again, harder. Tears started streaming down her face, freezing almost instantly. Nothing. Out of strength, she slid down to the ground, hugging Lily tight to her chest and pulling Noah in close. She wrapped her arms around them both, trying to shield them from the biting wind. "Shh, Mommy's here," she whispered, feeling their little bodies tremble. Grace looked up at the darkening sky and whispered a prayer she wasn't even sure anyone would hear. "Please. Someone. Anyone." And then, for the first time in hours, she heard it. The sound of an engine coming closer. A pair of headlights cut through the storm and a big black SUV pulled up in front of them. The driver's door swung open, and a tall, imposing figure jumped out. Grace blinked, trying to see better through the snow. A man, tall, wearing a heavy coat and boots, came running toward them. "Oh my God," she heard his deep voice say, full of shock and concern. "Are you hurt?" "The kids, they're freezing." Before Grace could even answer, her knees buckled and everything went black. Consciousness drifted back to Grace in broken waves. The smell of heated leather, the low hum of a powerful engine, the soft feel of a blanket being pulled over her shoulders. She blinked slowly, the gentle light inside the SUV stinging her tired eyes. "Hey, easy," the man's voice came again, deep and comforting. "You're safe now." Grace tried to sit up, but the dizziness pulled her back down. One thought cut through the fog of exhaustion. "My kid, where are they?" "Right here," the man said quickly, pointing to the back seat. Noah and Lily were curled up under a thick blanket, already clutching mugs of warm milk and coffee. Noah gave a tiny wave, and Lily, her eyes half closed, managed a weak smile. Grace let out a shaky breath and sank back into the seat. "I found you guys freezing on the ground," the man said, cranking the heater up. "You're lucky you're still alive." Grace turned her head to get a better look at him. His features were strong and striking, his jaw covered in a neatly trimmed beard, his blue eyes intense and alert. He looked completely out of place in that desperate scene, like someone who belonged to another world. "My name's Ethan Sullivan," he said, offering her a bottle of water. "And you are?" Grace hesitated, that old wariness tightening in her chest. But what choice did she have? Grace Turner. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her for a moment like he could see the toughness hidden behind her tired eyes. "Where do you live, Grace?" The question hit her like a punch. She looked out the window at the empty road, the snowstorm now swallowing up the landscape. "Nowhere," she whispered. Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out and grabbed a radio mounted on the dashboard. "Kate," he said into the device, "bring warm clothes and get the guest suite ready. We've got an emergency." The answer came back quick and professional. Understood, Mr. Sullivan. Grace frowned, confused. I don't, she started, but Ethan cut her off, his voice firm but gentle. You're not spending another night out in the snow with your kids, that's not an option. He started the SUV again, guiding it smoothly along the frozen road. Grace clenched her fists over the blanket. She didn't trust strangers. Life had taught her that lesson the hard way, but looking at Noah and Lily sleeping safely in the back seat, she knew she couldn't afford to turn down help. Where are we going? She asked, her voice still hoarse. Ethan shot her a sideways glance, a small smile tugging at his lips. To my place. The place, as Grace was about to find out, wasn't just a house. When the SUV climbed a long private driveway lined with towering pine trees, she caught sight of the massive mansion glowing against the white snow. It looked like something out of a dream, or a world she'd never belonged to. Grace swallowed hard, the fear creeping back up her throat. Why? She whispered. Why are you helping us? Ethan pulled the car up to the entrance, killed the engine, and looked straight at her. Because no one helped my mom when she needed it, he said simply. And for the first time, Grace saw that despite the wealth, the strength, and the security that surrounded him, there was a shadow in Ethan Sullivan's eyes, a past that still haunted him. And on that cold winter night under the heavy skies of Willow Creek, two broken souls crossed paths, not knowing that meeting would change their lives forever. The front door swung open before Ethan even had the chance to touch the handle. A middle-aged woman, impeccably dressed in a navy blue uniform, stepped out to greet them, carrying thick coats and wool gloves. Mr. Sullivan, she said with a small nod. Everything's ready. Thank you, Kate, Ethan replied. Grace barely registered the exchange. She was too busy trying to process everything she was seeing. The mansion was a masterpiece of stone and dark wood, with massive windows pouring out a warm golden light. Inside, the entryway was lined with polished oak floors, Persian rugs, and a crackling fireplace. It was like stepping into another universe. Noah and Lily stood there with their mouths wide open, their eyes huge as they took in the high ceiling with exposed beams and the carved wooden staircase winding up to the second floor. Whoa, Noah murmured, unable to hide his awe. Grace felt a wave of shame crash over her. She, with her ripped, dirty clothes and her kids, their cheeks smudged with dirt and cold, looked like muddy stains on a perfect painting. She pulled Lily closer, instinctively wanting to shield her from a world that clearly wasn't theirs. Kate gave a soft smile. Let's get you out of those wet clothes first. There's a hot bath waiting for you upstairs. Grace opened her mouth to protest, but Ethan was already speaking. Let it go, Grace, they need this. You do too. She shut her mouth, pride thrashing inside her like a wounded animal. But she knew he was right. And her kids deserved a moment of warmth and comfort, even if it was just for one night. Kate guided Noah and Lily up the stairs, leaving Grace and Ethan alone in the hallway. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy. Grace crossed her arms over her chest, shrinking in on herself. You didn't have to do this, she said, her voice low. Ethan planted his hands on his hips, watching her. Maybe not, he said, but I wanted to. Grace bit her lower lip, uncertain. She didn't trust kindness, not anymore. Life had taught her that every good deed came with a hidden price. And what's your price? She asked bluntly, locking eyes with him. Ethan didn't blink, didn't look away. None. Not today. Not ever. Grace wanted to believe him. Oh, how she wanted to. But life had beaten her hopes down so many times that trust felt like a trap. Ethan took a step back, like he could sense her hesitation. You and your kids can stay here tonight. Tomorrow. We'll figure out the rest. Sound fair? She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Just for today. Only today. With that, Ethan pointed down a side hallway. I'll fix something for you all to eat. Go rest, Grace. She wanted to argue, wanted to say she could take care of herself. But instead, she just muttered a hoarse thank you and slowly climbed the stairs. Each step felt like it weighed a ton. In the guest room, Grace found a king-size bed covered in soft sheets and thick comforters. Lily was already tucked in, her little face relaxed in rare, deep sleep. Noah, still awake, whispered, Mom, he's nice. Grace sat down beside him on the bed, smoothing his messy hair. Yeah, he is, she said, a lump tightening in her throat. at least for now. She didn't know how long they'd have here. Didn't know if this was real or just a temporary pause before they were back fighting the world again. But for now, Noah and Lily were safe. And that was enough. For now, the hot water rained down like a blessing over Grace's skin, washing away the dirt, the cold, and the desperation of the past few days. She closed her eyes, letting the water run down her face, wishing it could also wash away the invisible scars, the ones no bath could ever erase. When she stepped out of the bathroom wrapped in a soft robe, she found clean clothes folded neatly on the bed, a pair of comfy sweatpants, a wool sweater, and warm socks. She hesitated. She didn't want to owe Ethan anything, but the alternative was putting back on what was basically rags. Grace sighed and slipped into the clean clothes. When she came downstairs, she found Noah and Lily already settled in front of the fireplace in the living room, each holding a steaming bowl of soup. Ethan stood nearby holding a cup of coffee. He looked over at Grace and smiled but didn't say anything. Thank God. Grace sat down on the rug next to her kids, accepting the bowl Kate handed her with a gentle smile. "Thank you," she whispered. The soup was simple, chicken and vegetables, but to Grace it tasted like a feast fit for royalty. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, feeling life creep back into her body. Noah and Lily chattered excitedly, telling Ethan about the time they found a squirrel at school or how Noah almost caught a huge fish at the lake. Childhood stories that felt like they belonged to another life. Ethan listened with genuine patience, smiling, encouraging them to go on. Grace watched silently, her stomach twisting. It was too easy, too natural, and she knew nothing good in life ever came without a price. After dinner, Kate took the kids upstairs, promising to show them the house's library and some storybooks before bed. Grace stayed seated, tense, while Ethan moved around the room picking up the empty bowls. "You look like you're about to bolt out of that chair," he said casually. Grace clenched her hands on her knees. "I'm not used to—" She gestured around, struggling for the words. "This." Ethan let out a low, easy laugh, without a hint of mockery. "Nobody ever is." Grace looked at him, studying him. The dark jeans and thick wool sweater did little to hide his athletic build. He looked comfortable here, surrounded by wealth, but he also carried something heavy on his shoulders, something invisible but real. "Who are you?" she asked before she could stop herself. Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised by her bluntness. "Ethan Sullivan," he said with a crooked smile. "Mining fortunaire, businessman, and apparently now savior of stubborn moms and their kids." Grace didn't smile. She wasn't joking. "Why do this?" She pushed. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." Ethan's smile slowly faded. "Because," he started, and that shadow returned to his eyes. "When I was a kid, I went through something similar, only nobody stopped to help." Grace felt the air leave her lungs. He wasn't offering pity. He was offering understanding. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the firewood in the fireplace. "You don't have to trust me, Grace," Ethan said softly. "But just know that, at least for today, you and your kids are safe." Grace wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to. But believing was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. Still, in the warmth of that room, with her kids sleeping upstairs in soft beds and with Ethan looking at her like he truly saw her, a tiny, almost invisible crack formed in the walls she had built around her heart. And sometimes, a crack was all it took for the light to start getting in. Morning in Willow Creek was quiet and relentless. Snow blanketed the landscape like a cold, white cloak, reflecting the weak sunlight that tried in vain to warm the day. Grace woke to the soft sound of laughter coming from downstairs. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The bed was warm. The covers were heavy. The window showed an open field covered in snow. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the cold burning her skin. Then reality hit her like a bucket of ice water. She was in a stranger's house. A rich man's house. A man who, for all she knew, could change his mind at any moment. Getting up quickly, Grace dressed in the clean clothes Kate had left in the room and quietly made her way downstairs. Noah and Lily were sitting at the kitchen table, scarfing down pancakes and laughing while Ethan clumsily tried to teach Noah how to make shapes with maple syrup. The smell of fresh coffee, bacon, and baked bread filled the air, and for a moment, Just a moment. Grace wished she could freeze that scene and keep it forever, but reality knocked again. They didn't belong here. Grace cleared her throat to announce her presence, and Ethan looked up at her with an easy smile. "Morning," he said. "Hope you slept well." She just nodded, not trusting her voice. Kate appeared, drying her hands on an apron. "There are dry clothes for you guys in the laundry room. And if you need them, we've got boots, coats, whatever you need." Grace frowned. "Why?" she asked, her voice coming out harsher than she meant. Kate blinked, surprised. "Because it's snowing outside," she said simply. Grace felt the anger rise in her throat. Not at these people, but at the situation. At the helplessness. At the silent humiliation of being a mother who couldn't even guarantee her kids a warm coat. Ethan picked up on the tension and, with impressive calm, said, "Grace, nobody here's doing you a favor expecting something in return. Accepting help doesn't make you weak. It just makes you human." Grace crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She hated the way he spoke. With understanding. Without judgment. It was easier when people looked at her with pity or disdain. That she knew how to handle. But Ethan looked at her like he saw more. "We can't stay here forever," she said finally, her voice hard. Ethan gave a slight nod. "I know." He grabbed a cup and filled it with coffee, holding it out to her. "But for now, you can stay. Just until you get back on your feet." Grace took the cup, her hands trembling so much she almost spilled the hot liquid. She wanted to refuse. Wanted to grab her kids and run. But run where? Pride was a good thing. Until it started costing your kids their lives. Grace took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through her chest. She looked at Noah and Lily, their faces lit up by the simple joy of a hot meal. Maybe she could lower her guard. Just a little. For them. "All right," she said quietly, almost a whisper. "But just for now." Ethan smiled, like he knew that small concession was actually a monumental victory. "Just for now," he agreed. But deep down, they both knew that some for nows had the power to change an entire life. The next few hours passed in a quiet blur, a kind of uneasy peace Grace didn't quite know how to handle. After breakfast, while Kate kept Noah and Lily busy with drawings and stories in the reading room, Ethan suggested Grace step outside for a bit to see the property. "No pressure," he said, raising his hands like he was surrendering. "But sometimes a walk helps clear your head." Grace hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse, to cling to her kids like the world might collapse at any second. But the other part, the tired, worn-down part that was so exhausted from fighting all the time, just wanted to breathe. "5 minutes," she said, crossing her arms. Ethan smiled like he already knew she'd say that. 5 minutes. He led her out through a side door, where a narrow path wound its way through the snow-covered fields. The borrowed boots sank into the soft snow, crunching with every step. The cold bit at her exposed skin, but the sky was such a deep blue it looked painted, and the sun reflected off the snow like millions of tiny diamonds. Grace kept a safe distance from Ethan as they walked. "This property belonged to my grandfather," he said after a while. "He started out in mining, but he always dreamed of owning a piece of land for himself." Grace didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. His world, vast lands, inheritance, freedom, felt so far removed from hers that she could barely imagine it. "I grew up here," Ethan went on, lazily kicking at the snow with the toe of his boot. "But I spent most of my life trying to escape it. Studying in big cities, traveling, searching for something." Grace shot him a sideways glance. "And did you find it?" Ethan let out a short laugh. "Still looking." She couldn't help a small, cynical smile. "Some of us don't have the luxury of looking." Ethan stopped, turning to face her. "Grace, finding a home, a purpose, and it's not a luxury. It's survival." His words hit her in an unexpected way. She crossed her arms tighter over her chest, her old armor snapping back into place. "Home," she murmured. "Is that what you think you're offering?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I can't offer you something you don't want to accept." He shrugged. "But I can offer safety, time, and maybe a fresh start." Grace looked out over the landscape, the gentle hills blanketed in white, the red barn in the distance, the lazy smoke rising from the house chimney. An entire world different from the one she came from. A world where her kids could grow up without fear. She squinted against the bright glare of the snow. "And what do you get out of it?" she asked, her voice hard. Ethan smiled, but it was a sad smile. Maybe it's my chance to fix something inside myself. Grace didn't know what to do with that answer. She didn't know how to handle someone who didn't want anything in return. So instead of speaking, she just kept walking, letting the words hang in the cold air between them. Ethan didn't push. He just walked beside her in silence, like he understood that sometimes the greatest show of strength was simply waiting. And as the cold wind whipped against their faces and their footsteps left trails side by side in the untouched snow, Grace realized against her will that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to trust him. A little. The rest of the day passed at a strange pace, like time in Willow Creek had its own rhythm, slower, heavier. Grace spent the afternoon watching Noah and Lily play in the reading room. Kate had given them an old set of wooden blocks, and now they were busy building castles and towers, their laughter filling the air. It was a simple scene, normal, happy, and it terrified Grace more than the storm outside. She sat in an armchair near the window, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the snow swirling outside. But her mind was far away. She remembered another time, another winter, when she thought she'd found safety too. She remembered the man who had promised to protect her, to help her raise Noah and Lily. She remembered how those promises melted away at the first sign of trouble. She remembered his look, full of contempt, as he left her alone in a cheap clinic, one child in her arms and another still in her belly. She had sworn to herself that day that she would never depend on anyone again. Never give anyone the power to break her like that. Grace squeezed her eyes shut, forcing her breathing to stay steady. And now here she was, sitting in a luxurious house that wasn't hers, accepting the food, the warmth, and the generosity of a man who said he didn't want anything in return. Should she trust it? Or was she just walking into another trap? The soft creak of the floor drew her attention. Ethan was standing at the door watching her. He didn't say anything. He just leaned his shoulder against the doorframe and waited. Grace turned her face away, embarrassed at being caught so lost in her own thoughts. "You don't have to stay," she said, her voice hoarse. "I can take care of myself." Ethan crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze steady and calm. "I know you can." She frowned, surprised by his answer. "Then why?" "Because," he cut in with a half smile, "sometimes the people who know how to take care of themselves the best are the ones who deserve a little peace the most." Grace opened her mouth, then closed it. What could she even say to that? Ethan stepped forward. "Grace, I'm not here to save you." His voice was low, deep. "You already did the hard part yourself. You survived. You took care of your kids. I just want to give you space to breathe, to think, to remember that there's still good in the world." Grace felt her eyes sting, but she blinked quickly, refusing to let the tears fall. She stood up abruptly. "I need a minute." Without waiting for a response, she crossed the room and hurried upstairs, closing the bedroom door behind her. Grace leaned her back against the cold wood, closing her eyes. She was scared. Not of Ethan, but of herself, afraid of what she was starting to feel, afraid that if she let her guard down, if she allowed herself to believe again, the ground would vanish beneath her feet. In the silent room, she slid down to the floor and hugged her knees. It was easier to be cynical, easier to believe that everyone would leave. But Ethan, he didn't act like the others. And for the first time in a long time, Grace realized that the battle she needed to fight wasn't against the world. It was against the walls she had built around her own heart. Downstairs, Noah and Lily's laughter echoed through the hallway, and Grace knew that sooner or later, she would have to decide, run or stay. And maybe, just maybe, build something new, something she thought she'd never have again. A family. The silence in the room was heavy, like an invisible presence pressing against Grace's chest. She didn't know how long she sat there, fighting her own fears, her memories, her doubts. When she finally stood up, the sky outside was already darkening again, tinged with shades of lavender and gold. She went downstairs slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. No more children's laughter echoed through the house. That sudden calm made her even more nervous. She found Ethan in the kitchen washing dishes like it was the most normal thing in the world. He looked up when he saw her, and something inside her settled just at the sight of him. Steady, patient, unshakable. "They're sleeping," he said softly, drying his hands on a dish towel. Kate read them a few stories. Noah tried to stay awake, but he didn't last more than 5 minutes. Grace smiled in spite of herself, picturing it. "Thank you," she said, her voice coming out low. Ethan tilted his head. "You never have to thank me for taking care of your kids," he said seriously. "I'm doing it because I want to, not because I expect anything in return." Grace took a deep breath, gathering courage. "Ethan," she began, but he raised a hand, stopping her. "I know what you're going to say," he said, "that this is temporary, that you'll leave as soon as you can." Grace nodded, ashamed. That was exactly what she was going to say. Ethan leaned back against the sink, crossing his arms. What if it didn't have to be that way? Grace frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" He studied her for a moment, like he was weighing every word. "I have a huge property, more land than I can take care of by myself, more rooms than I can use, and for years I've been thinking about starting a small community farm, something that actually makes sense, giving people a chance to start over." Grace looked at him skeptical. "And what does that have to do with me?" Ethan gave her a small smile. "Everything." He uncrossed his arms and took a step toward her. "I want to offer you and the kids a home. Not just a temporary shelter, a real home." Grace blinked, stunned. You don't even know me," she stammered. Ethan let out a soft sigh. "I know enough. I know the look of someone who's been trying to hold up the whole world by herself. I know how much strength that takes." He smiled sadly. "And I know that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who need someone by their side the most." Grace shook her head, taking a step back. I can't accept that. It's not fair. It's not charity," Ethan said, his voice firm. "It's a proposal. You help take care of the property, look after the animals, help Kate in the kitchen if you want, work however you want. In exchange, you and your kids get safety, stability, peace." Grace felt the tears burn behind her eyes. It was everything she wanted, everything she had prayed for, even when she'd already stopped believing it could exist. But it was risky. Opening her heart again was always a risk. "And what if I fail?" she whispered, barely getting the words out. Ethan gave her a half smile. "Then we'll fail together." Silence settled between them. This time it wasn't heavy. It was full of possibilities. Grace closed her eyes, trying to listen to what her own heart was saying. And for the first time in a long time, the answer wasn't fear. It was hope. When she opened her eyes, she found Ethan's gaze, patient and steady as ever. "Give me some time," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to think." Ethan nodded. "Take all the time you need, Grace. I'm not going anywhere." And in that moment, under the soft lights of the kitchen with the lingering smell of fresh coffee and baked bread in the air, Grace felt, deep in her chest, that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found something stronger than fear, a place to start over. The night fell heavy over Willow Creek, and the wind howled through the cracks in the windows, carrying with it the promise of more snow. Grace sat on the edge of the guest room bed, staring at the woven blanket covering her knees. Ethan's offer echoed in her mind like a persistent drumbeat impossible to ignore. A home, honest work, safety for Noah and Lily. It was everything she had ever wanted, everything she had fought so hard to earn on her own. And now, someone was offering it on a silver platter. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to choke down the fear rising in her throat. Nothing came free. Nothing was safe. But what if this time was different? A small whimper broke through her thoughts. Lily, her blonde hair spread across the pillow, stirred restlessly in her sleep. Grace got up and gently pulled the blanket over her. Then she walked over to Noah's bed, where he lay sleeping, his face relaxed in the innocence of childhood. She sat down beside him, running her fingers through his soft hair. "Noah," she whispered. He mumbled something half awake. "Mom?" Grace hesitated. "If you could wish for anything, anything at all, what would you wish for?" Noah yawned, rubbing his eyes. "A place to live," he said with the devastating simplicity only a child could have. "A warm place, with real food, where we could stay together forever." Grace felt her stomach twist. She swallowed hard, her decision settling inside her like a heavy anchor. "And if someone wanted to give that to us?" she asked, barely getting the words out. Noah thought for a moment. "I'd say thank you." He smiled sleepily and rolled over, pulling the blanket up to his chin. Grace sat there for a long time after he fell back asleep, her heart tight in her chest. The answer was so simple for Noah. He didn't see hidden dangers or second intentions. He only saw a chance. Maybe she needed to learn to see that way too. With a heavy sigh, Grace got up and walked to the window. Outside, the snow was falling slowly and steadily, covering the world in a fresh, bright layer. A new beginning. She didn't know what the future would bring. Didn't know if she had the strength to trust someone fully again. But she knew this much. She couldn't let fear control her life. She couldn't teach her kids to hide from the world. If there was a chance, even a small one, to build something better, she had to try. Grace closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the cold glass. Tomorrow, she would give Ethan her answer. And for the first time in a very, very long time, a spark of hope lit up the darkness inside her. The dawn brought a thick, almost reverent silence. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the world blanketed in a pristine white layer that shimmered under the soft morning sun. Grace stood at the window for a long time before she found the courage to go downstairs. Noah and Lily were still sound asleep, their faces peaceful. They deserved this. They deserved so much more. With her heart pounding, she crossed the hallway toward the kitchen where the smell of fresh coffee and toast already filled the air. Ethan was there, sitting at the table, flipping through some papers absent-mindedly. When he saw her, he set the papers down and smiled. A quiet, unhurried smile, like he already knew she would come. Grace stopped in the doorway for a moment, gathering every bit of courage she had left. "Ethan," she called, her voice firm despite the knot in her throat. He raised an eyebrow, patient, waiting. Grace took a deep breath. "I accept." The words came out like a release, leaving her feeling vulnerable and strong all at once. Ethan didn't react right away. He just watched her with those calm, steady eyes, giving her the space to truly feel the weight of her decision. After a long moment, he smiled. Not the forced smile she was used to seeing from people who wanted something from her, but a real smile. Relieved. Almost hopeful. "Welcome, Grace Turner," he said softly. The tension in her shoulders eased a little, even though fear was still there, lingering in the background. She knew trust would be a process, not something decided overnight. But saying yes was the first step. Ethan stood up, grabbed 2 mugs of coffee, and held one out to her. "Shall we talk about how this is going to work?" Grace took the cup with trembling hands. "Okay." They sat down at the table, side by side. Ethan explained calmly. She could choose her daily tasks, no pressure. There were animals on the small farm that needed care, chickens, a few horses, and a garden just starting to grow inside a makeshift greenhouse. Kate would still help with the kids, but Grace would have space to find her own rhythm. "You're not a maid here, Grace," Ethan emphasized. "You're building something with us. And when you're ready to find your own path, if you want to," he shrugged, "I'll help make that happen too." Grace swallowed hard, touched by his sincerity. "Do you always help strangers like this?" she asked, trying to sound sarcastic, but her voice came out almost gentle. Ethan let out a low chuckle. "No, only the ones who make my world feel a little less empty." Grace didn't know what to say. The weight of his words settled over her gently, warm and unsettling. After a moment, Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Let's take it slow, Grace. One step at a time." She nodded, grateful that he understood even without her having to explain. They sat there in a comfortable silence, sipping their hot coffee as the golden morning light filled the kitchen. It was the beginning of something new, something scary, something beautiful, and for the first time in a very long time, Grace allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she and her kids had finally found a place where they could grow, not just survive, but become a family. The days that followed were a quiet test for Grace. She woke up early even before the sun rose, helped Kate in the kitchen, fed the chickens behind the barn, and slowly began learning how to care for the horses, though she still kept a respectful distance from those massive animals. It was hard work, it was exhausting, but it was different from anything she had ever known. Here, work didn't come with shouting or threats. It came with encouraging smiles, patient instructions, and the freedom to make mistakes and try again. Noah and Lily, for their part, seemed to bloom overnight. Lily loved helping Kate mix cake batter in the kitchen, even if more flour ended up on the floor than in the bowl. Noah, on the other hand, stuck to Ethan like a shadow, following him all over the property, soaking up everything like a little sponge, from how to fix a fence to how to feed a newborn foal. Grace watched it all from a distance, her chest tight with a mix of joy and fear. The ease with which her kids adapted to Ethan was both beautiful and terrifying. They were trusting. They were opening up. And she knew how much that could hurt if everything fell apart. But Ethan never moved faster than she could handle. He didn't push conversations, didn't ask too many questions. He was just there, steady as the sunrise. On Wednesday, after a long afternoon of barn repairs, Grace found Ethan in the stable mucking out the stalls. She hesitated at the entrance, watching him. He wasn't what she expected from a rich man. There was no arrogance in him, no presumption, just calloused hands and an easy smile, saved for the moments he thought no one was looking. "You work harder than the horses themselves," Grace said, trying to sound casual. Ethan looked over his shoulder and smiled. "They still beat me in speed," he joked. She took a few hesitant steps inside, the smell of hay and leather filling the cold air. Grace began, then stopped, nervous. Ethan set down the pitchfork and turned to her. Patient. "Go ahead." She fiddled with the hem of her shirt, an old nervous habit she thought she'd left behind years ago. "I wanted to thank you," she said finally, her voice low, "for what you're doing for me. For my kids." Ethan tilted his head, his smile fading into a softer, more serious expression. "You don't owe me anything, Grace." "No thanks." She bit her lower lip, fighting the instinct to retreat. "Still," she insisted. "Thank you." Ethan stepped closer. Not enough to invade her space, but close enough for her to feel his warmth in the cold air. "You know," he said, his voice low, "sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is accept that they deserve to be helped." Grace held her breath. Those words hit something so deep inside her she didn't even know it was still there. She opened her mouth to respond, but right then Noah came running into the stable, holding a handful of feed. "Ethan, come see. I fed the baby horse all by myself." Ethan immediately stepped back, smiling at the boy. "Really? Sounds like you've earned a reward." Noah laughed and sprinted back out into the yard, Ethan following him, laughing like they were old friends. Grace stood there for a moment alone, trying to steady the whirlwind inside her. She had never wanted to trust anyone again, but sometimes, she thought, watching Ethan laughing with Noah in the distance, sometimes trusting wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to realize she didn't have to face the world alone anymore. Not anymore. The snow had stopped, but the cold still lingered, biting at the skin and painting the air with that crisp feeling of an endless winter. That night the sky looked more starry than Grace could ever remember seeing. After dinner, a simple but delicious meal of beef stew and fresh bread, Ethan suggested something unexpected. "How about we make a little bonfire in the backyard?" Noah and Lily practically jumped out of their chairs, their eyes sparkling with excitement. "Can we roast marshmallows?" Noah asked, almost stumbling over his own words. Ethan laughed. "Of course we can." Grace hesitated. The night was cold, and the ground was still damp with melted snow. But seeing the excitement on her kids' faces, she couldn't say no. Minutes later, they were all gathered around a small makeshift bonfire in the snow-covered yard, blankets draped over their shoulders and steaming mugs of hot chocolate in their hands. Ethan helped Noah stick marshmallows onto thin branches while Lily snuggled in Grace's lap, her eyes heavy with sleep but stubbornly refusing to miss out on the fun. Grace looked around. The warmth of the fire reflected on their faces, painting everything with a soft golden glow. Noah's laughter echoed across the quiet field. The smell of burning wood and melting sugar floated in the air. It was such a simple scene, almost ordinary. But to Grace, it was magic. It was the kind of moment she thought she would never have. The kind of moment that for so long had only been a distant dream. She felt her eyes sting and blinked quickly to push the tears away. Ethan was watching her from across the fire. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. His gaze, warm, steady, patient, said it all. "You're safe here. You're welcome here." You belong here. Grace hugged Lily tighter against her chest, breathing in the sweet smell of her daughter's hair. For a moment she allowed herself to forget the past, forget the fears, forget the scars, and just live. Close your eyes and make a wish, Ethan said, smiling at the kids. Noah squeezed his eyes shut, his tongue peeking out in concentration. Lily mumbled something inaudible, already half asleep in her mother's arms. Grace looked at Ethan across the flickering fire, her heart pounding. She knew she should make a wish too, but at that moment she realized maybe she already had everything she wished for. Peace, safety, a family, and maybe love. The thought scared her more than any brutal winter, any hunger, any abandonment. But at the same time, it warmed her chest in a way she didn't know was still possible. Ethan smiled at her, a small, almost shy smile, and Grace felt the spark ignite. Something was changing, something was growing, and this time, she wasn't so sure she could, or even wanted to, stop it. After the fire died down and the kids, exhausted, were carried inside by Kate, the night in Willow Creek grew even quieter. The snow crunched under Grace's boots as she and Ethan doused the last embers with buckets of water. The cold was biting, but the warmth of what had happened between them lingered in the air, invisible and undeniable. Grace rubbed her hands together for warmth, blowing hot air over her fingers. Ethan watched her silently, his face lit only by the faint glow spilling from the house windows. "Did you have fun tonight?" he asked, his voice low, layered with something more. Grace stuffed her hands into her coat pockets, pretending a disinterest she didn't feel. "The kids did," she said. She paused, her gaze drifting to the dark trees in the distance. "And she hesitated, then smiled, small and shy. "I did too." Ethan smiled back, slow and deliberate, as if savoring every second of her answer. For a moment they just stood there side by side, with no rush. The wind played with Grace's loose hair, and she pulled her hood up with an automatic gesture. Ethan, moved by an impulse that felt too natural to be planned, reached out and adjusted her hood for her, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek. The touch was so brief, so soft, it could have gone unnoticed. But it didn't. Grace froze, her heart pounding. She lifted her gaze to Ethan's, and what she saw there made the ground seem to vanish beneath her feet. Desire, not the selfish, urgent kind she knew too well. It was something deeper, something far more dangerous. It was desire mixed with respect, with care, with a tenderness that threatened to melt every wall she had spent years building. Ethan looked like he was about to say something, but he stopped himself. Instead, he took a step back, giving her space. "Grace," he started, his voice rough. She waited, her heart lodged in her throat. But he just shook his head like he was fighting with himself. "Good night," he said finally, his voice firm but filled with everything left unsaid. Grace blinked, confused but nodded. "Good night." Ethan hesitated for just a second longer, then turned and walked back toward the house, leaving solitary tracks in the snow. Grace stayed where she was, the icy wind biting her cheeks, her breath coming out in soft white clouds. Part of her wanted to run after him. Part of her wanted to run as far away as possible, but above all, for the first time, she felt something she could no longer ignore. She wanted to stay. And that, she realized with a painful tightness in her chest, was the scariest step she had ever taken. Far scarier than accepting help. Far scarier than trusting. It was the first step toward loving again. And this time, she didn't know if she would survive the fall. The next morning broke gray and heavy, announcing the arrival of another storm. Grace woke to the sound of distant thunder and the smell of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen. She dragged herself out of bed, the memories of the night before still burning under her skin. The way Ethan had looked at her. The way he hadn't forced anything, and yet had said everything with a simple touch. Grace walked slowly downstairs, her heart pounding unevenly. She found Kate serving breakfast, golden pancakes and steaming cups of black coffee. Noah and Lily were already at the table, animated despite the gloomy sky. Ethan wasn't there. Grace felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. "Ethan's out at the barn," Kate said, reading her thoughts with a disconcerting ease. "The snowstorm's coming earlier than we thought. He needs to reinforce the doors before the wind gets too strong. Grace nodded, silently grateful for the information. After making sure the kids were busy, she grabbed a jacket and crossed the yard toward the barn. The snow had started falling again, fine and sharp, whipping against her face. When she pushed open the heavy barn door, she found Ethan alone, hammering reinforcements onto the wooden latches. He turned at the sound of the door, his eyes meeting hers instantly. Grace hesitated in the doorway. "Need some help?" she asked, her voice rough. Ethan smiled. That slow, devastating smile. Always. She walked toward him, picking up one of the hammers lying on a workbench. For a while they worked in silence, the sound of hammering echoing through the empty barn. The tension between them was palpable, like the electricity hanging in the air before a storm. As Ethan held a board in place, Grace climbed a small ladder to hammer the top part. A strong gust of wind hit outside, making the whole structure shudder. Instinctively, Grace lost her balance. Before she could fall, she felt Ethan's strong hands catch her waist, holding her steady. The world seemed to freeze in that instant. They stayed there, motionless, Grace's body pressed against his, the warmth of his touch burning through all the layers of clothing like they weren't even there. She looked at him, and what she saw in Ethan's eyes stole her breath. Desire, but also respect, patience, something dangerously close to love. Grace should have stepped away. She should have thanked him, regained her balance, and gotten back to work. But she didn't do any of that. Instead, she stayed right where she was, letting herself be held, letting herself be seen. "You scare me," she whispered, not even realizing she was speaking. Ethan frowned slightly but didn't loosen his grip. "I would never hurt you, Grace." She believed him. God, she believed him. And that was what terrified her. With a shaky breath, Grace climbed down from the ladder, her movements slow, careful. But Ethan didn't let go right away. He just slid his hands up to her shoulders, keeping her close, looking right into her. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said softly. Grace closed her eyes, her heart pounding so loudly it seemed to fill all the space around them. "I'm not afraid of you," she murmured. "Then what?" Grace opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "Of myself," she admitted, her voice breaking. Ethan gave a small, sad, understanding smile, one she was beginning to know all too well. "Then we'll take it slow," he promised. "One step at a time." And with infinite patience, he let go of her shoulders, giving her space. Not pressuring her, not demanding anything, just being there. Grace felt something break inside her, and at the same time, something new was born. Maybe she could trust. Not trust Ethan, but trust herself, and that changed everything. The storm hit Willow Creek with a fury that seemed to shake the earth itself. The wind howled against the house walls, making the windows rattle in their frames. The snow whipped in furious swirls, swallowing the outside world in a thick white curtain. Grace curled up in a chair in the living room, pulling Lily into her lap as Noah snuggled against her side. Kate brought extra blankets while Ethan checked the door locks for the third time just to be sure. "It's going to be all right," he said, crossing the room to join them. The fireplace crackled loudly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The heat of the fire was comforting, but it was Ethan's presence that truly kept the fear at bay. Grace watched as he sat down on the floor, stretching his hands out toward Lily. "How about we tell some stories until the storm passes?" he suggested, his voice gentle. Lily, still a little scared, nodded shyly. Noah immediately brightened. "I want to go first. I want to go first." Grace laughed, the sound escaping her lips before she could stop it. It was a light, unguarded laugh, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt something so easy. Noah told a ridiculous story about a flying horse saving a village of talking kittens. Lily, slowly relaxing in Grace's arms, giggled at her brother's wild inventions. When it was Ethan's turn, he leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Once upon a time," he began, his voice low and deep, "there was a brave little girl who, even when everything seemed lost, never stopped believing that a new beginning was possible." Grace held her breath. Ethan continued, without looking directly at her. "And one day, after many struggles and many tears, she found a place where she was loved, where she was safe, and where, for the first time, she could simply be." The silence that followed was heavy. Grace felt Noah rest his head on her shoulder, his small body relaxing in pure trust. She felt Lily fall asleep in her lap, her tiny fingers still clutching Grace's sweater. And she felt Ethan's eyes meet hers. There were so many things unspoken between them, so many silent promises floating in the air. Grace took a deep breath. She didn't know what the future would bring. She didn't know if her fears would disappear tomorrow, or the day after, or ever. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire, by the sound of the storm trying and failing to breach the fortress they had built together, she knew one thing for sure. For the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to build something real, something that could last. Ethan smiled at her, small but full of meaning. Grace smiled back, allowing herself to feel, just feel, what was growing between them. Delicate and strong like a flower blooming through the ice. It wasn't just safety. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something much, much deeper. And for the first time, she didn't run. She stayed. The next morning dawned clear and still. The whole world seemed to have changed overnight. The storm had passed, and in its place Willow Creek had transformed into a sparkling, untouched sea of snow. The trees bowed under the weight of frozen branches, and the air, though still cold, was calm and serene. It felt like the world had been given a second chance. Grace stood for a long moment on the doorstep, taking it all in. Noah and Lily were bouncing with excitement, already bundled in their winter clothes, hopping from foot to foot, eager to explore the new world. "Come on, Mom!" Noah shouted, nearly sinking up to his knees in the snow. Lily clapped her little hands, laughing, pure joy shining on her face. Grace hesitated, pulling her coat tighter around her body. Then she felt Ethan's warm hand lightly touch her back. "Come on," he said quietly. "You deserve this too." She looked at him and saw the invitation in his eyes. Not just to walk through the snow, but to be part of it. To be part of something new. With a trembling sigh, Grace nodded. Together they crossed the yard, their feet sinking into the soft snow with each step. Noah ran to the top of a small hill and threw himself down, laughing as he slid on his belly down the slope. Lily tried to copy him, but ended up falling backward into the snow, where she stayed, laughing uncontrollably. Grace couldn't help the laugh that slipped from her lips. Ethan watched her, fascinated. "You should try it," he said, his voice carrying something more than just playfulness. Grace raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Sliding down an ice hill? I'll pass." Ethan laughed, a deep sound that made her smile without meaning to. "Then come with me." Before she could protest, he held out his hand. Grace looked at it, hesitant. It was a simple gesture, but it meant so much. She slid her hand into his. Ethan's fingers closed around hers, warm and firm, and Grace felt the impact of that touch echo all the way down to her chest. And together, hand in hand, they walked through the snow, leaving footprints side by side in the pristine white blanket. When they reached the top of the small hill, Ethan stopped, still holding her hand. "Look at that," he murmured. The valley below them was covered in a carpet of untouched snow. The sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, tinting the world in gold and silver. It was beautiful. It was new. It was full of promise. Grace looked out at the view, feeling tears sting her eyes. Not from sadness, but from something much more overwhelming. Hope. And then, without rushing, without speaking, Ethan lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, in a way that made her close her eyes against the intensity of the moment. A simple gesture, but full of promises. Grace opened her eyes and found his gaze, silent and steady, like the earth itself. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The answer was there, in the way she didn't pull her hand back, in the way she stayed there beside him under that new sky, under that new life. And for the first time in her life, Grace felt, deep in her soul, that she wasn't just surviving. She was starting to live, for real. The day moved slowly, lazily, wrapped in the warmth of the house and the good kind of tiredness that only a day of laughter and playing outside could bring. Noah and Lily fell asleep early, exhausted, their cheeks still rosy from the snow. Grace stayed in the kitchen helping Kate put things away, but her thoughts were far away, caught in the soft touch of Ethan's hand, in the light kiss he had pressed to her fingers under the morning sky. When she finally allowed herself to sink into the living room sofa, she found Ethan already there, a steaming cup of tea in his hand, his gaze lost in the flames of the fireplace. Grace hesitated at the doorway. Part of her wanted to run. Part of her knew this moment was inevitable. With a soft sigh, she crossed the room and sat in the armchair beside him. For a while they sat in silence, listening only to the crackling of the wood. Then Ethan spoke. "My father," he began, his voice rough, "wasn't like me." Grace turned her head to look at him. He was still staring into the fire, as if the light could shield him from the memory. "He believed strength was everything," Ethan continued, his voice so low that Grace had to lean closer to hear. "That asking for help was weakness. That trusting was foolishness." Grace felt her chest tighten. Growing up here, in this place. He gestured vaguely to the house, to the land outside. It was beautiful, but it was also lonely. It didn't matter how many fields or horses there were. It didn't matter how big the house was. Not if you felt invisible inside it. Grace bit her lower lip, feeling his pain as if it were her own. "When I finally left," Ethan said, letting out a humorless laugh, "I swore I'd never be like him. I swore I'd build something different." He finally looked at her, and what Grace saw in his eyes made her forget how to breathe. Pain, hope, a hunger for something more. "But for a long time," he went on, his voice cracking, "all I built were walls. I thought if no one got close, no one could leave me." Grace blinked quickly, fighting back tears. She understood that. God, she understood. "And now?" she whispered. Ethan smiled faintly, a sad and beautiful smile. "Now, I'm trying to build bridges." He extended his hand toward her without touching her. A silent offer. Grace looked at that hand for a long moment. It would be so easy to say no, so easy to retreat back into the safety of loneliness. But the memory of the morning, the warmth of his hand in hers, Noah's smile as he ran through the snow, all of it weighed more than the fear. With trembling hands, Grace reached out and laced her fingers through his. The touch was simple, but the meaning was immense. And in that instant, under the golden light of the fire and the sweet scent of burning wood, Grace knew she wasn't just accepting Ethan's hand. She was accepting the chance at a new life, at love, at belonging, at home. And when Ethan pulled her hand into his lap, holding it like it was the most precious thing he had ever touched, Grace closed her eyes and allowed herself to believe. Some beginnings are scary. Some second chances are fragile. But some are exactly what you always needed, even if you didn't know it. Time seemed to slow down in Willow Creek. The days that followed were filled with a soft, comforting routine. Cold mornings began with Grace feeding the chickens, Noah running across the frozen fields, and Lily helping Kate in the kitchen. Afternoons were spent repairing fences, caring for the horses, preparing simple meals, and sitting around the table sharing stories and laughter. Ethan was always nearby, never rushing, never demanding, just being the safe harbor Grace hadn't known she needed. As the days passed, Grace began to realize that fear, her old companion, still whispered sometimes, but it was growing weaker. Every time Ethan held her hand without pressure, every time Lily cuddled up to him without fear, every time Noah ran to show off some new achievement with pride shining on his face, Grace felt the bricks of her old walls crumble a little more. It was on a golden afternoon when it happened. Winter was finally beginning to give way to the shy promise of spring. The wind was still cold, but the sun peeked through the clouds, casting patches of light over the melting snow. Grace was outside, hanging clothes to dry when Ethan approached. He watched her for a moment, that small, steady smile on his lips. "You look at home," he said simply. Grace turned toward him, a light shirt in her hands, her heart beating hard. She smiled, and for the first time the smile came easy. "I am," she said. The words were simple, but they echoed between them like a promise. Ethan took a step closer, touching her face with the tips of his fingers, as if he still couldn't believe she was really there. With him, Grace didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes for a moment, letting his warmth seep through the last fragile layers of fear. When she opened her eyes, she found Ethan smiling, an open, radiant smile, full of emotion. And then he kissed her, without rush, without doubt. A kiss full of tenderness and reverence, as if he were kissing not just a woman, but the future they were both choosing to build. Grace kissed him back with all the love, all the hope, and all the courage she had held inside for so long. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Grace rested her forehead against his. "Are you sure?" Ethan whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Grace laughed softly, tears shining in her eyes, but there was no sadness there. "For the first time in my life, yes." On the porch, Noah and Lily watched, curious and smiling, sensing, even if they didn't fully understand, that something important had just happened. Grace reached out her hand to them, and Noah ran first, Lily right behind him, their laughter ringing through the crisp air. And there, under the vast Willow Creek sky, surrounded by endless fields and the scent of wet earth, Grace knew she wasn't running anymore. She had found what she had always been searching for: a home, a family, a love that didn't need grand promises, just presence, steadiness, and the daily choice to stay. And sometimes, Grace thought, that's exactly what the true miracle of life looked like. Simple, gentle, and absolutely perfect.